In the last 10 months, we have seen, for the first time in American history, in peacetime, our national debt grow to the level of our entire annual GDP. It's never happened in peacetime before. In the last 5 months, records have been kept since 1850, but this probably goes back to pre-American Revolution. The net investment capital flow to the United States for the first time ever went negative. There was always more money flowing into the United States until about 5 months ago, and for the first time it's gone negative. There's now going out, and that is a very dangerous sign. Last August, first time in American history, we saw the credit rating of the United States taken down from AAA. This is an historic moment. It really is. What's all this going to lead to? I don't know. That part of the history book hasn't been written yet. But it tells me we can't keep thinking, well, we're just going to go forward because, you know, we have always done it this way, we're always going to. The present agitation will continue until one side prevails. We've got to find some way to come out of this. Either we're going to, because of the growth of the government, become more that Western European socialist model, or we are going to go back to the more traditional role of American exceptionalism as defined by historians, which doesn't have anything to do with the size of our economy or size of our government. It is just more individual sense of self-reliance where individuals can rise, as opposed to having this collectivist thing where we're all equal in outcome. I mean, this is a fascinating time. I wouldn't want to live any other time in history than where we are right now, even though the outcome is so uncertain.
This firmly, correct me if I'm mischaracterizing your point of view on this, but this firmly entrenched brand of conservatism that you're espousing, when our credit rating was downgraded, I think it was the Standard & Poor's report cited this kind of economic polarization as one of the reasons that the credit rating was downgraded. Raising the debt ceiling is not new in America. It happened more than a dozen times under George W. Bush. I think it happened almost 20 times under Ronald Reagan. But suddenly, this last time around, it became something of a national obsession.
Right.
So you mentioned Ronald Reagan earlier in response to, you know, Tom's question about this. You know, Ronald Reagan actually used the word amnesty when discussing illegal immigration. He supported the Brady Bill. There's a New York Times op-ed he wrote in 1982. You know, he's known for cutting taxes. He also raised them a few times when the red ink was starting to get out of control. I mean, you see Reagan as something of a conservative ideologue. I mean, I kind of see him as a pragmatist who, with the Democratic Congress, went across the aisle and cut deals and got things to happen. But what I'm hearing from you is and again, correct me if I'm mischaracterizing what you're saying, the sense I get from you is that you want to move in the opposite direction.
I would, because I think if you picked Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, from 81 to 88, and you brought him into 2012 and set him back in the White House, it would be a totally different set of rules. I don't see Harry Reid, I don't see Nancy Pelosi ever being the type of people who would have worked with him the way Tip O'Neill did. And I forget who the Senate leader was at the time, but who the Democratic Senate leader was. But again, that only happened because Ronald Reagan basically went around them, got to the very heart of the population with the Reagan Democrats, and made them realize this was in their best interest too. But I think the political polarization is so hard right now that strategy of that day wouldn't work today. You know, I do believe, and you're right, Ronald Reagan raised taxes a couple times, but if Ronald Reagan were here today, he wouldn't be saying, let's raise taxes. And here's another little fun fact. You know, if you confiscated at 100% tax rate all the income of Americans who earned over $250,000 last year, well, not last year, but the year before, took everything, if you earn more than $250,000, took every dime of it, you would take in about $280 billion to the U.S. Treasury. We're spending $4 billion a day more than we take in today. So we would have changed nothing else. That means on January 1st of that next year, we would have a balanced budget for 70 days, and then we're right back to losing $4 billion a day. We can't tax enough. In Reagan's era, when the debt was lower, when the deficit was much lower, they could plan on economic growth to help counteract that. Right now, we're not seeing that economic growth. Back to China a moment ago. You know, China was running 19, 18% annual GDP rates. That's tremendous. The only way we're going to get out of this hole, and Reagan would be the first to agree with this, it isn't to tax more. It certainly, we can't, there's not the political will, and I'm the first to admit this, to cut our way out of it. We have to grow the economy. And we have to grow the economy at something like 3.5 to 3.8% per year, every year. And if we don't reduce the regulatory environment, if we don't reduce the tax environment, we're not going to see that happen. That is our only answer in getting out of this. And I think if Reagan were here today, he would recognize that as a conservative approach. You know, again, you look at the long span of history, the political parties kind of cross over and do different things. You know, what does conservative mean, what does liberal mean? But if you took Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and put him here today, I think you'd see what I'm saying as being the prevalent type of thought.
He might not have much of a chance in a primary fight, though.
I don't know. His personality was such, he always seemed to overcome those kind of obstacles. But, you know, one thing I always appreciated about him, and this was a trait of Lincoln as well, when people would fight it out with Ronald Reagan, fight it out, he always took the point of view, we never have enemies, we just have opponents. And when the fight would end, he would act like it never happened. You know, the guy who said that his economic plan was voodoo economics, remember who coined that phrase? George Herbert Walker Bush, the guy he chose to be vice president. The guy that continually was telling America he's too old to be president. James Baker, his chief of staff, Secretary of State. I mean, he would bring people in who didn't necessarily always get along with him, but he recognized them for who they are. And
in the greater picture, though, isn't this what we need to do with government? Like when you had mentioned, he attracted Reagan Democrats, but you know, you've got
but how did he
somewhat centrists in Maine, and you've got liberals in California, and you've got people looking after Hispanic interests in places like Texas and Florida. We've got all these disparate groups of people, and when you're talking about this vision of a strictly conservative House, a Senate, and a White House, you can't even get a candidate nominated in your own party. You're going to nominate a candidate whose signature legislative achievement is universal health care with an individual mandate. I mean, talk about irony.
And again, that goes back a few years. But to my point, and you use the word vision, I'll join you with that term for a moment, to where Reagan was and what I'm saying is an ideal. Again, why did Reagan Democrats get to be known as Reagan Democrats? It's because he appealed to them. Not because they thought, oh, he's a pretty good-looking guy, used to be an actor, was in Bedtime for Bozo. They had this appeal to him because he said what the country ought to be, and we're going to go there. I remember he hadn't been in office for a few months, and I don't know if you all remember this, but the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Union, he fired him. And everybody expected all the unions to go on strike and shut down the country, and it didn't happen. Why? Because he said, you know, their contract doesn't allow them to go on strike. They didn't go on strike, they quit. And he was very direct and he was very open. He said what he meant what he said. And he brought people on board because of that. I think that's why we see such little connection with Congress today, because who's out there on behalf of the legislative branch of government saying, this is what we mean, this is what we say, this is what we're going to do. And it isn't because they don't get along, because neither side is doing it. As I said, with Obamacare, the Democrats have failed miserably in selling Obamacare, and the Republicans have failed miserably in trying to articulate what it is that those people think we should be. And it isn't, in my interpretation, it isn't that the system's failing, the people in the system are failing to make the argument. You know, we have this wonderful communications media, and to me, it's the best part of politics is when you can inflict your opinion on somebody else, as you can probably tell after the last half hour. I love the argument. You know, someone asked me the other day if I was invited to go on Chris Matthews' Hardball, would I be there? In a minute. I'd love to do that show. I'm not afraid of defending my values, and who knows, I may actually win a few. Is it MSNBC, CNN, whatever? Maybe win a few of those people over to my side.
A few times in our conversation today, you mentioned that we need changes in the tax structure and also the regulatory environment.
Yep.
Can we take that out of the general and put it into the specific? Can
Sure.
you give me like maybe 3 bullet points on each
Sure.
that you think would better facilitate an environment that would be more business friendly?
Be delighted. I am one who believes we absolutely have to change the tax code, and we have to go to a consumption-based, in some way, tax code. Why? Because last year 47% of all American households paid no income tax. They don't care how big government gets. Why should they? It doesn't cost them anything. They're not paying any income tax. Now they're paying Social Security and others. And I think we have to go to some type of national sales tax. Upon saying that, I'm always asked, well, have you signed on to the fair tax? Do you believe in the fair tax? No, I haven't signed on to that, because step one in that process has to be to pass a balanced budget amendment as presented by Senator Mike Lee 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, that would cap federal spending at 18% of the GDP. Until Mike Lee's plan was put forward, there have been several attempts at passing a balanced budget, but they always had a flaw which said simply, we'll have a balanced budget, which meant the more government spent, they just raise taxes more and more and they spend, but it'd be balanced. That's the bad way. Mike Lee said we need to balance the budget, we need to cap spending at 18% of the GDP. And as high a number as that is, today we're spending 26, so it'd be quite a rollback. And last but not least, in that balanced budget amendment, it would require a supermajority to ever raise the number, supermajority of both the House and the Senate. If you do that, you know what the income's going to be, and then you can go back to the overall tax code and say, okay, we want this much for consumption tax, we want this much for corporate tax, and if you want to keep other taxes, you include it. So I see it as a phased-in process.
Tied to GDP.
Yeah, absolutely, with spending limited to GDP. Okay. And by the way, I hear a lot, though it hasn't come up in this discussion, well, Mr. Lugar has all the seniority, and it takes seniority to get things done. Mike Lee had been in the United States Senate 6 weeks when he presented that plan, which was voted out as the cut, cap, and balance. It wasn't seniority that got it there, it was somebody coming in from the outside with a different point of view. So that's very important. On the regulatory side, and this could be another 2 hours of discussion here. You know, the biggest thing, I believe, that is slowing the economic recovery of the United States is the regulatory environment in the financial world. Dodd-Frank needs to be repealed. It is a disaster. It is a bureaucracy that is still looking for its mission in many ways, especially with the Office of the Consumer Financial Counselor position. The Dodd-Frank has put so many more regulations in the banking world that it causes them not to be able to loan money. It is the classic case of the United States government and the law of unintended consequences. When 2008 took place, the word on the street was systematic failure. If one big bank goes down, it takes down another, it's a series of dominoes. So we got to get away from having about a handful of big banks to having somewhat smaller banks and more of them. We need to diversify. That's always a good strategy in investing. You need to diversify. That's where they started. What they ended up with was, instead of having a handful of really big banks, now there's about 3. And they have now put into law, promulgated into law, the doctrine of too big to fail. Before, it was kind of made up on the fly. But now they've put it in law. They've put a safety net under these several big banks. Question: if you have a safety net under you, do you think you'll be inclined to take more or fewer risk? You're going to take more risk, of course you are. So they basically put us in a position where at some point in the future this is all going to happen again. Even worse, instead of having a having this somewhat smaller but more banks, the cost they've put on local banks is now so heavy in doing enforcement that you're seeing the number of local and especially community banks, we're already seeing this in Indiana, where they're either merging or just going away. One of my duties as state treasurer, I serve as investments secretary for the board for depositories. I don't think I've ever missed a meeting, by the way. Just throw that in. And one of the things we do, if City of Evansville wants to put money in a bank, it has to be listed by the board for depositories. You can't put money in there unless we approve you. A year ago, we had 197 depositories in Indiana. Now we're down to about 174. And we expect by this time next year to be 145. When those community banks in Indiana go away, and they didn't fail, they weren't failures, but when they go away simply because of the adverse operating environment put on them by the FDIC and the Federal Reserve, I think that's a bad thing for communities. You know, I lived in Evansville when it was Meade Johnson. Meade Johnson had a real direct impact. It was based here, it was involved in the community. Not quite the same when it's Bristol Myers. Same thing's happening in our banking world, and I think that's unfortunate. Other regulatory environment. Mr. Lugar's been speaking a lot of what he's done with the Keystone Pipeline. To me, that is a classic case. What he did is a classic case of validating government bureaucracy. He passed a law that said the president had to decide. Well, the president did. He said, no, we're not building the pipeline. Mr. Lugar wants to claim, oh, he was doing all this to save these jobs. Well, guess what? It didn't work. Had I been there, I would have taken exactly the opposite approach, and I would have started with this question. How many congressmen does it take to build a freaking pipeline? In 1975, when I came out of graduate school, the the US EPA was really just being started. It was designed to be a almost, I can't think of a good word, but sort of a national storing house, a national database, a national regulatory agency that would be dealing with the environmental issues, but it wasn't an enforcement agency. Enforcement was going to come because every single state under the EPA directive that formed the EPA, every single state had to form its own environmental agency that would have unique knowledge of that state's own ecology, hydrology, geology, topography. It would know all that stuff at a local basis. And there was a magic series of words. Every one of those agencies had to have regulations in force at least as stringent as the federal guideline. That's where we started. Today, every state along the Keystone Pipeline has its IDEM. In Indiana, we call that agency, Indiana Department of Environmental Management, South Dakota Environmental Quality. Every one of those state agencies approve the pipeline. So why do we have to have another layer of bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. saying, not so fast. You may know your ecology, you may know your hydrology, you may know your geology, you may know everything about your state, but we have the power. Why? That's where we need to be taking that regulatory environment down and putting it back at the states where it belongs.
If one of the states had decided that they didn't want a pipeline, would you have been in favor of the federal government getting involved in mandating its construction through their state?
No, I wouldn't have. I mean, first of all, I think that is a state issue. I don't think that situation would occur. I understand where you're going with the hypothetical, but I think it ought to be a state issue. I mean, it was a federal government issue in one sense only, and that is that infinitely narrow line between Canada and the United States, there's an international crossing, and that made it a national issue. But there are hundreds of pipelines already that flow from Canada to the United States to Canada. There was nothing exceptional about this one. And now, by making this more of a national issue, as I said, I think Senator Livermore validated the position. And I almost see it as the perfect example to define the difference between Dick Lugar and Richard Murdock. He saw the federal government mechanism as a place to get something done, and let's do it. And I say, let's get the federal government out of it so it can just get done. You know, he sees a new farm program as the answer to America's farmers. I talk to those farmers. I hear they want less government. They don't want the Army Corps of Engineers dictating that their property is a wetland. They don't want to have the US EPA saying 2.5 microns of particulate matter is too much. They don't want the, I mean, it's just the difference between the federal level and the state level, and that's where he and I have great differences.
Thank you.
I knew I would bring you down. Well, I appreciate the time, and I really do enjoy these sessions, and hope you enjoyed the debate, if that's what it was, or otherwise found it, at least my points of view informed, if not